Billionaire took a Christmas Eve flight furious, until he saw his ex-wife holding their twins. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. Denver International Airport buzzed with the chaotic energy of Christmas Eve travelers. Families rushed past with oversized luggage. Children clutched stuffed animals, and the overhead announcements echoed through the terminal in multiple languages. The scent of cinnamon rolls from nearby cafes mixed with the antiseptic smell that always reminded Cassandra Hayes of the hospital where she worked. Cassandra stood near gate B12, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the straps of her navy blue diaper bag. At 30, she had learned to carry herself with the quiet confidence that came from saving premature babies in the neonatal ICU. But today felt different. Today, she was taking Luke and Violet to meet their maternal grandparents for the first time, and the weight of that responsibility pressed against her chest like a stone. "Mama, airplane." 2-year-old Luke pointed excitedly at the Boeing 737 visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His sandy brown hair caught the afternoon light, and his bright green eyes sparkled with wonder. Beside him, Violet clutched her favorite stuffed elephant, her identical green eyes more cautious as she took in the bustling scene. "That's right, baby. We're going to fly to see Grandma and Grandpa," Cassandra said, crouching down to their level. She smoothed Violet's dark hair, so similar to her own long waves, and felt that familiar ache in her chest. The ache that came every time she looked at their faces and saw traces of someone else, someone she had tried so hard to forget. The boarding announcement crackled through the speakers. "Flight 447 to Denver. We're now boarding passengers in first class and our platinum members." Cassandra gathered their things, hoisting Violet onto her hip while Luke grasped her free hand. They made their way toward the gate, joining the growing line of passengers eager to get home for Christmas. The children's excitement was infectious, and despite her nerves, Cassandra found herself smiling as Luke chattered about clouds and birds. She had worked double shifts for months to afford this trip. The tickets, the gifts for her parents, the new outfits for the kids. It had all stretched her budget thin, but seeing Luke and Violet's faces when she told them about the adventure made every sacrifice worth it. Her parents lived in a small town outside Denver, the same place where she had grown up, fallen in love for the first time, and had her heart broken 3 years ago. "Economy passengers, rows 20 through 35, you may now board." As they shuffled forward in line, Cassandra's mind wandered to the conversation she'd had with her mother the night before. Her mom had gently asked again about the children's father, the question she'd been avoiding for almost 3 years. Cassandra had given her usual response, that he wasn't in the picture, that they were better off without him. But the truth was more complicated than that. The truth was that she had been too proud, too hurt, and too scared to try harder to find him when she discovered she was pregnant. They reached their seats in row 28. Cassandra had splurged on the extra legroom, knowing she'd need the space for the car seats and all their gear. As she worked to secure Luke and Violet, several passengers squeezed past in the narrow aisle. A businessman in an expensive navy suit caught her attention briefly. Something about his confident stride and broad shoulders reminded her of someone, but she pushed the thought away. Denver was full of successful men in suits. It didn't mean anything. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration as Cassandra distributed coloring books and snacks to keep the twins occupied. Violet had fallen asleep against her elephant, but Luke remained wide-eyed and alert, pressing his face to the small window. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a slight delay due to air traffic control. We should be departing in about 10 minutes. Thank you for your patience." Cassandra sighed and leaned back in her seat. 10 minutes turned into 20, then 30. Luke was getting restless, and she could see other passengers growing impatient. She pulled out her phone to text her parents about the delay, when a commotion near the front of the plane caught her attention. A man in first class was speaking in raised tones to a flight attendant. Even from her seat in economy, Cassandra could hear the frustration in his voice. Something about missing an important dinner, about how delays like this were unacceptable. His voice carried that particular tone of authority that came from being accustomed to getting his way. "Some people," muttered the elderly woman across the aisle, shaking her head disapprovingly. But Cassandra wasn't listening to the complaint anymore. She was listening to the voice itself, deep, resonant, with that slight rasp that had once whispered her name in the darkness of their shared apartment. Her heart began to race, and her palms grew sweaty as she strained to get a better look at the man causing the disturbance. It couldn't be. Not here. Not now. Not on Christmas Eve with his children sitting right beside her. The man turned slightly in his seat, running a hand through dark brown hair that had been perfectly styled despite the long day of travel. When his profile came into view, Cassandra felt the air leave her lungs in a rush. The strong jaw, the straight nose, the way he held his shoulders. It was unmistakably Damon Prescott. But this wasn't the Damon she remembered. Gone was the casual button-down and khakis of the mid-level tech employee she had loved and lost. This man wore a suit that probably cost more than her monthly salary, a watch that glinted platinum in the cabin lights, and an air of success that seemed to radiate from every fiber of his being. Luke chose that moment to spill his juice box, the apple liquid spreading across the small tray table and onto the floor. "Uh-oh, Mama," he announced loudly. Cassandra's hands shook as she reached for napkins, her eyes still fixed on the back of Damon's head. She couldn't look away, couldn't process what she was seeing. The flight attendant was walking away from him now, apparently having reached some resolution to his complaint. Any moment he might turn around fully. Any moment he might see her. "Are you okay?" the elderly woman asked, noticing Cassandra's pale complexion. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Cassandra managed a weak smile as she cleaned up Luke's spill. "I'm fine, just tired." But she wasn't fine, not even close, because sitting 20 rows ahead of her was the father of her children, the man she had spent 3 years trying to forget, the man who had no idea he had 2 beautiful babies who had inherited his green eyes and stubborn chin, the man who had apparently become exactly what she always knew he could be, while she had been raising their children alone. The plane's engines finally roared to life, and they began taxiing toward the runway. Cassandra closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. It was a 2-hour flight. She just had to keep Luke and Violet quiet, stay in her seat, and pray that Damon wouldn't notice them. Denver was a big airport. They could easily avoid each other during the layover. But as the plane lifted off into the gray December sky, Cassandra couldn't shake the feeling that this Christmas Eve was about to change everything. The question that had haunted her for 3 years suddenly seemed more urgent than ever. What would Damon do if he discovered the truth about Luke and Violet? And more terrifying still, what would she do if he wanted to be their father? The flight had been cruising at 30,000 feet for 45 minutes when turbulence hit. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a sharp ding, and the captain's voice crackled through the intercom, apologizing for the rough air ahead. Cassandra instinctively tightened her grip on Violet, who had awakened from her nap with a confused whimper. "It's okay, sweetheart, just a little bumpy," Cassandra whispered, stroking her daughter's soft hair. Luke, ever the brave one, giggled at each jostle of the plane, treating it like an amusement park ride. The turbulence worsened, causing several passengers to gasp as the aircraft dropped suddenly. Cassandra's stomach lurched, but not from the plane's movement. Through the gap between seats, she could see Damon standing in the first-class aisle, one hand braced against the overhead compartment as he spoke to a flight attendant. His expensive suit jacket hung open, revealing a crisp white dress shirt that fit his broader frame perfectly. He had filled out since she last saw him. The lanky tech worker she remembered had been replaced by a man who clearly had access to personal trainers and custom tailoring. Success suited him, she realized with a pang of something that felt uncomfortably like pride, mixed with loss. A particularly violent bump sent a woman's purse flying from the overhead bin, its contents scattering across the aisle. Without hesitation, Damon abandoned his conversation to help gather the spilled items, his movements careful and considerate despite the plane's erratic motion. He handed the woman her belongings with a genuine smile that Cassandra recognized instantly, the same smile that had made her fall in love with him years ago. "Thank you so much," the woman gushed, clearly flustered by both the turbulence and Damon's attention. "You're very kind." "No trouble at all," Damon replied, steadying himself against a seat as the plane shuddered again. His voice carried that same warmth Cassandra remembered, though there was something more polished about it now, more refined. As he turned to return to his seat, his gaze swept across the cabin, a casual glance that froze mid-sweep when it landed on row 28. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, Damon Prescott stared directly at Cassandra Hayes, his green eyes widening with unmistakable recognition. Cassandra felt heat flood her cheeks as their eyes met across the narrow aisle and 20 rows of passengers. Time seemed suspended, the turbulence and noise of the plane fading into background static. In that moment she was 27 again, standing in the doorway of their shared apartment, watching him pack his clothes into a duffel bag, while harsh words hung between them like broken glass. Damon's lips parted slightly, as if he were about to speak her name, but then Luke chose that moment to drop his coloring book, which slid under the seat in front of them. "Mama, my book," Luke announced with the dramatic flair only a toddler could manage. The spell broke. Cassandra tore her gaze away from Damon to help Luke retrieve his coloring book, her hands trembling as she reached under the seat. When she looked up again, Damon was still standing in the aisle, but his expression had changed. The surprise was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Confusion, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. His eyes moved from Cassandra to the children beside her. Luke was chattering happily about his lost crayon while Violet remained curled against her mother's side, sucking her thumb. Damon's gaze lingered on Luke's profile, taking in the boy's sandy brown hair and the stubborn set of his chin. Then he looked at Violet, studying her delicate features and the way she held her stuffed elephant protectively against her chest. Cassandra watched the precise moment when realization began to dawn in Damon's eyes. It started as a flicker of uncertainty, grew into a frown of concentration, and finally crystallized into something that looked like shock. His hand gripped the seat back in front of him so tightly that his knuckles went white. The turbulence subsided, and the seatbelt sign turned off with another ding. Around them, passengers began moving about the cabin again, but Damon remained frozen in place, staring at the children who were completely oblivious to the storm of emotions their existence had just unleashed. "Sir?" A flight attendant appeared at Damon's elbow, her voice professionally concerned. "Is everything all right? You look pale." Damon blinked, seeming to remember where he was. Yes, I'm fine. Thank you." His voice was hoarse, strained. "I thought I recognized someone." The flight attendant followed his gaze toward economy class, but from her position, she couldn't see what had captured his attention. "Would you like me to get you some water?" "No," Damon said quickly, then seemed to catch himself. "Thank you, but I'm fine. I should return to my seat." But he didn't move, not for another full minute, during which Cassandra felt his eyes on her like a physical weight. She busied herself with Luke and Violet, straightening their clothes, organizing their snacks, anything to avoid looking back at him. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was certain the entire plane could hear it. When she finally risked another glance, Damon was walking slowly back toward first class, but he turned to look over his shoulder twice before disappearing behind the curtain that separated the cabin sections. Each time their eyes met, Cassandra felt a jolt of the old electricity that had once existed between them, now complicated by 3 years of separation and the monumental secret sitting beside her in car seats. "Mama, who was that man?" Luke asked, with the uncanny perceptiveness that children sometimes displayed. "He was looking at us funny." Cassandra's throat felt tight. "Just another passenger, sweetheart. Sometimes people like to look at cute kids on airplanes." But Luke wasn't satisfied with that answer. He craned his neck to peer toward the front of the plane. "He looked like my daddy in my head." The simple statement hit Cassandra like a physical blow. Luke had never known his father, had never even seen a photograph, but somehow his intuition had picked up on something fundamental and true. Violet, who had been quietly observing the exchange, patted her brother's arm with the kind of gentle wisdom that seemed beyond her years. "Daddy's not here, Luke," she said softly. "Just us and Mama." Cassandra pulled both children closer, breathing in their familiar scent of baby shampoo and the apple juice Luke had spilled earlier. "That's right, baby girl, just us." But even as she said the words, she knew they were no longer true. Damon had seen them. He knew, or at least suspected, and there would be no hiding from the conversation that was now inevitable. The careful life she had built as a single mother, the story she had told herself about being better off alone, all of it was about to come crashing down at 30,000 feet on Christmas Eve. In first class, separated by 20 rows and a curtain, but feeling closer than he had in 3 years, Damon Prescott sat in his leather seat with his head in his hands, trying to process what he had just witnessed. 2 children with his eyes, his chin, his stubborn cowlick. 2 children who looked to be exactly the right age. The math was simple, brutal, and undeniable, and it changed everything. The beverage service had reached the middle of the plane when Cassandra noticed him approaching. Through the narrow gap between seat backs, she could see Damon making his way down the aisle, pausing occasionally to let the flight attendants pass with their cart. His movements were deliberate, purposeful, and she knew with sinking certainty that he was coming to find her. "Juice, please," she told the flight attendant when the cart reached their row, her voice steadier than she felt. Luke and Violet were both coloring quietly, blissfully unaware of the emotional storm approaching. Cassandra's hands shook as she opened their apple juice boxes, memories flooding back of the last time she and Damon had been in the same space together. That morning 3 years ago, when pride and hurt feelings had driven them both to say things they couldn't take back, when she had thrown his engagement ring at the wall and told him to leave, when he had walked out without knowing she was carrying his children. "Excuse me?" The voice was deeper than she remembered, refined by 3 years of commanding boardrooms and closing million-dollar deals. "Cassandra?" She looked up slowly, taking in the man standing in the aisle beside her seat. Up close, the changes were even more striking. Damon had always been handsome in a quiet, understated way, but success had given him a confidence that seemed to radiate from his skin. His green eyes, so familiar yet somehow more intense, searched her face with an expression she couldn't quite read. Damon. His name felt foreign on her tongue after 3 years of silence. I didn't expect to see you here. I think we need to talk." His gaze shifted to Luke and Violet, lingering on their faces with an intensity that made Cassandra's chest tighten. "Please." Luke looked up from his coloring book, his bright green eyes, Damon's eyes, meeting his father's for the first time. "Hi," he said with the casual friendliness of a child who hadn't yet learned to be suspicious of strangers. "I'm Luke. This is my sister Violet, and my mama." Cassandra watched Damon's face pale as Luke spoke. The little boy's voice, his mannerisms, even the way he tilted his head when he was curious, it all echoed Damon in ways that made denial impossible. Violet looked up shyly from behind her elephant, offering a small wave before tucking her face back into the stuffed animal's soft gray fur. "Luke," Damon repeated quietly, as if testing the name on his tongue. "That's a strong name for a strong boy." The simple interaction seemed to break something loose inside Cassandra. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she watched Damon crouch down to Luke's eye level, his expensive suit wrinkling without regard for the cost. "How old are you, Luke?" Damon asked, his voice carefully controlled but audibly strained. 2.5, Luke announced proudly, holding up 2 fingers and then attempting a third. "Violet too. We're twins." The confirmation hit Damon like a physical blow. Cassandra could see him doing the math, calculating dates, remembering their last night together before the fight that ended everything. His jaw tightened, and when he looked at her again, his eyes held a mixture of wonder, hurt, and something that looked like barely contained fury. "We really do need to talk," he said quietly, his voice taking on an edge that made several nearby passengers glance in their direction. Now, Cassandra's protective instincts flared. Not here. Not in front of them. Then where? Damon's control was slipping, and she could see the emotions warring beneath his composed exterior. "Because I've spent the last 15 minutes trying to figure out how this is possible, and the only explanation I can come up with is that you've been keeping my children from me for 2.5 years. The word "my" hung in the air between them like an accusation. Cassandra felt the familiar surge of defensive anger that had characterized so many of their arguments during their relationship. But this time, the stakes were infinitely higher. "Lower your voice," she hissed, glancing around at the other passengers who were starting to take notice of their conversation. "You have no right to make demands or cause a scene." "No right?" Damon's voice was incredulous, though he did lower it to a harsh whisper. "They're my children, Cassandra. I can see myself in both of them. How could you not tell me?" Luke and Violet had stopped coloring, sensing the tension between the adults even if they didn't understand it. Violet had started to suck her thumb, a habit that emerged when she felt anxious, while Luke watched the exchange with the intense focus he usually reserved for construction trucks and fire engines. "It's complicated," Cassandra said weakly, hating how inadequate the word sounded even to her own ears. "Complicated?" Damon ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she remembered from their countless arguments. "I've missed their first words, their first steps, their birthdays. I don't even know when their birthdays are, Cassandra. My own children, and I don't know when they were born." "June 15th, she whispered, the date feeling heavy with significance. It had been exactly 9 months after their last night together, after the makeup session that had given them both false hope for reconciliation. Damon closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, the hurt there was so raw it made Cassandra's chest ache. "June 15th. They're 2.5, which means—" He trailed off, the implications clearly hitting him. "You knew when you left. You were pregnant when we had that fight, weren't you?" The accusation in his voice made her defensive walls slam back into place. Yes, I was pregnant. But you walked out, Damon. You chose your career over us, remember? You were so eager to follow your dreams to Seattle that you didn't even look back. Because you threw your ring at me and told me you never wanted to see me again. His voice rose slightly before he caught himself, glancing around at the curious stares they were attracting. You said I was selfish, that I would never be the man you needed. What was I supposed to think? Excuse me. A flight attendant appeared beside them, her professional smile strained. Is everything all right here? We've had some complaints about raised voices. Cassandra felt heat flood her face. We're fine. Just catching up with an old friend. The flight attendant's skeptical expression suggested she wasn't buying the explanation, but she nodded politely. Perhaps this conversation would be better continued after we land. We still have about an hour left in the flight. After she moved away, an uncomfortable silence settled over their row. Luke had gone back to his coloring, but kept glancing up at Damon with undisguised curiosity. Violet remained hidden behind her elephant, though Cassandra could feel her daughter's attention focused on the strange man who seemed to upset her mama. Look, Cassandra said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. This isn't the time or place for this conversation. We're both going to Denver for Christmas. Maybe we can figure this out then. Damon's laugh was bitter. Figure this out? Cassandra, you've hidden the existence of my children from me for almost 3 years. There's nothing to figure out. There's only what happens next. The certainty in his voice sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't the uncertain young man she had loved and lost. This was someone who had learned to take what he wanted, someone accustomed to getting his way, someone with the resources to make her life very complicated if he chose to. What do you want? She asked quietly. I want to know my children. The simple statement carried the weight of absolute conviction. I want to be their father, and I want to understand how we got here. To this moment when I'm meeting my own kids for the first time on a plane. Cassandra looked down at Luke and Violet, her heart breaking at the thought of disrupting their simple, stable world. They had never asked about their father, had never seemed to feel the absence of something they'd never known. But looking at Luke now, seeing how his eyes lit up every time Damon spoke, she wondered if she had been wrong about that too. The plane began its initial descent, and the captain's voice announced their approach to Denver. In less than an hour they would be on the ground, and the careful life she had built would be forever changed. The only question now was whether that change would bring healing or destroy everything she had worked so hard to protect. Denver International Airport was a maze of holiday chaos. Families struggled with oversized luggage while Christmas music echoed from overhead speakers, mixing with gate announcements and the constant hum of conversation in a dozen languages. The moment the plane's doors opened, passengers rushed into the jet bridge like water through a broken dam, eager to reach their Christmas destinations. Cassandra moved slowly, deliberately taking her time to gather their belongings, while Luke and Violet chattered excitedly about the big airplane adventure. And she could feel Damon's presence somewhere behind her in the first-class section, could sense his impatience even through the crowd of deplaning passengers. Her hands shook as she packed their coloring books and snacks, knowing that every second she delayed was another second to prepare for whatever came next. Mama, are we staying here? Violet asked, clutching her elephant as they finally stepped onto the jet bridge. The airport beyond looked enormous and intimidating to her small eyes. No, sweetheart. Grandma and Grandpa are waiting for us. Cassandra hoisted the diaper bag higher on her shoulder, balancing Luke on her hip while Violet held tightly to her free hand. We just have to walk through the big building first. But as they emerged into the gate area, Cassandra's careful plans crumbled. Damon was waiting for them, leaning against a pillar with his carry-on bag at his feet and his phone pressed to his ear. He looked every inch the successful businessman even after the 2-hour flight, his suit barely wrinkled and his hair still perfectly styled. Cancel the dinner reservation, he was saying into the phone, his eyes fixed on Cassandra and the children. Something's come up, something important. Luke tugged on Cassandra's hand. Mama, it's the nice man from the airplane. Damon ended his call and walked toward them, his expression unreadable. Other passengers flowed around them like water around stones, but Cassandra felt frozen in place, caught between her desire to run and her knowledge that running would solve nothing. We need to talk, Damon said without preamble. My driver is waiting. I can have him take you wherever you're going and we can discuss this on the way. We have a rental car, Cassandra replied automatically, though the truth was she couldn't afford both the rental and the hotel, and had been planning to sleep in the airport if necessary before driving to her parents' house in the morning. Damon's expression suggested he knew she was lying, but he didn't challenge her directly. Instead, he crouched down to Luke and Violet's level, his movement careful and deliberate. "Hey there, Luke." "Violet. How was your first airplane ride?" "It was bumpy," Luke announced with enthusiasm. "But Mama said it was just clouds dancing." A ghost of a smile crossed Damon's face. "Your mama always was good at making scary things sound beautiful." The casual intimacy of the comment hit Cassandra like a physical blow. It was such a small thing, but it reminded her that this man had once known her better than anyone, had once understood her quirks and fears and the way she tried to protect the people she loved from harsh realities. "Damon, please," she said quietly. "Not here. Not in front of them." "Then where?" His voice was patient, but implacable. "Because I'm not walking away this time, Cassandra. I can't unknow what I know now." Before she could answer, her phone rang. Her mother's cheerful face smiled up from the screen, and Cassandra felt a fresh wave of panic. How could she explain any of this to her parents? How could she tell them that the father of their grandchildren was standing 3 feet away, that the man she had never told them about was now demanding to be part of their lives? "Hi, Mom," she answered, forcing brightness into her voice. "Honey, did you land safely? Your father and I are so excited to finally meet Luke and Violet. We landed, but there's been a complication." Damon was watching her intently, and she could see him listening to every word. Luke had wandered a few steps away to examine a colorful airport display, while Violet remained pressed against Cassandra's leg, thumb in her mouth. "What kind of complication?" Her mother's voice carried the sharp edge of worry that came from 30 years of nursing and raising 4 children. Cassandra looked at Damon, seeing something in his expression that might have been understanding, or perhaps calculation. "I ran into someone I used to know, someone important." "Oh." Her mother's tone changed, becoming carefully neutral in the way that meant she was trying not to jump to conclusions. "I see. Do you need us to come get you?" "No, Cassandra trailed off, realizing she had no idea what she needed. Everything she had planned for this trip, every conversation she had imagined having with her parents, had been turned upside down by 5 minutes of turbulence and a chance encounter. Damon stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and unfamiliar that replaced the simple soap and deodorant she remembered. "May I?" He gestured toward the phone. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, but Luke chose that moment to run back and grab Damon's hand with the casual trust that children showed to adults who seemed safe and interesting. "Tell Grandma about the nice man," Luke suggested happily. Cassandra stared down at her son's small hand wrapped around Damon's much larger one, and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Whether she liked it or not, this moment had been inevitable since the second Damon's eyes met hers on the plane. Perhaps it had been inevitable since the moment she discovered she was pregnant and couldn't find the courage to track him down in Seattle. "Mom," she said into the phone, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need to ask you something, and I need you not to ask questions until I can explain everything in person. Cassandra, you're scaring me. Can Luke and Violet stay with you tonight? Just tonight. I need to handle some things." There was a long pause before her mother answered. "Of course they can stay, you know they can, but honey, I'll explain everything tomorrow, I promise. I'll bring them by around noon, and we'll have Christmas dinner together like we planned. But tonight," she looked at Damon, who was watching Luke examine his expensive watch with the fascination only a toddler could muster. "Tonight, I need to have a conversation that's 3 years overdue." When she hung up, Damon was studying her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "Your parents don't know about me." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "No, they don't know about you. And Luke and Violet have never asked about their father?" The question cut deep, partly because it was fair and partly because the answer was more complicated than a simple yes or no. "They're 2.5, Damon. They ask why the sky is blue and whether dogs can talk. The concept of absent fathers isn't really on their radar yet, but it will be." His voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. "Someday they'll ask, and what will you tell them then?" Before she could answer, a cheerful voice called out across the gate area. "Cassie, oh my goodness, is that really you?" Cassandra turned to see Janet Morrison, her old college roommate, approaching with a wide smile and arms outstretched for a hug. Janet looked exactly the same as she had years ago, all blonde highlights and designer handbags, the kind of woman who made motherhood look effortless and glamorous. "Janet," Cassandra managed, accepting the enthusiastic hug while trying to process this new complication. "What are you doing here?" "Christmas with my parents, same as every year. But look at you." Janet's gaze swept over Luke and Violet, with the practiced eye of someone who had 3 children of her own. Are these your babies? Oh my God, they're gorgeous, and twins. Luke and Violet, Cassandra said automatically. They're 2.5. 2.5. That means… Janet's expression shifted as she did the math, remembering conversations from college about Cassandra's relationship with the quiet tech guy who had stolen her heart. Her gaze moved to Damon, taking in his expensive clothes and confident bearing, and her eyes widened with recognition and surprise. Well, Janet said slowly, her voice taking on the careful neutrality of someone navigating unexpected social territory. This is certainly a Christmas surprise. Damon extended his hand with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to making good impressions. Damon Prescott. And you are? Janet Morrison. Cassie and I went to college together. She shook his hand while studying his face with undisguised curiosity. I remember her mentioning you. The understatement of the century, Cassandra thought grimly. Janet had been there for every fight, every makeup, every tearful phone call during the rocky months before Damon moved to Seattle. She had also been there the night Cassandra discovered she was pregnant and couldn't decide whether to call him or pretend it never happened. Small world, Damon said neutrally. Isn't it just? Janet's smile was bright and sharp. So what brings you all to Denver? Family Christmas? The question hung in the air like an unexploded bomb. Cassandra could feel Damon's tension, could see him weighing his options, deciding how much truth this moment could handle. Luke was still examining Damon's watch, completely oblivious to the adult undercurrents swirling around him, while Violet had migrated to hide behind Cassandra's legs again. We're figuring that out, Damon said finally, his gaze finding Cassandra's across the space between them. Aren't we, Cassandra? It was both a question and a challenge, and she knew that her answer would set the tone for everything that came next. The airport bustled around them, full of families heading home for Christmas, but in that moment it felt like the 3 adults and 2 children were the only people in the world. Yes, she said quietly, her heart hammering against her ribs. We're figuring it out. The hotel bar was nearly empty on Christmas Eve, with only a few business travelers nursing drinks, while CNN played silently on the mounted television. Cassandra sat across from Damon at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. They had dropped Luke and Violet at her parents' house an hour ago, and the absence of the children's chatter felt deafening. Her parents had been gracious to Damon if bewildered by his sudden appearance. Her father had shaken his hand with the careful politeness of a man trying not to jump to conclusions, while her mother had studied his face with the sharp intuition that came from decades of reading people in crisis. Luke had been excited to show his new grandparents his coloring book, while Violet had warmed up enough to let her grandmother hold her elephant. They're good with them, Damon said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since they left the suburban ranch house. Your parents, they seem like the kind of grandparents every kid should have. Cassandra nodded, not trusting her voice. Watching Damon meet her parents, seeing him crouch down to hug Luke and Violet goodbye, had stirred emotions she had spent 3 years trying to bury. The careful walls she had built around her heart felt fragile, threatening to crumble with each small kindness he showed their children. They don't know, she said finally, about you being their father. They think you're just someone I used to date, which is technically true. Damon's voice carried no judgment, just a quiet sadness that made her chest ache. Though it doesn't quite capture the whole story, does it? The whole story. 3 years of raising twins alone, of midnight fevers and first steps witnessed by no one but her. 3 years of wondering if she had made the right choice, of lying awake at night imagining different conversations, different outcomes. 3 years of Luke asking innocent questions about other kids' daddies and Violet, creating elaborate imaginary friends to fill the spaces in their small family. I tried to find you, she said quietly, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. When I first found out I was pregnant, I called your old job, but they said you'd moved to Seattle. I didn't have your new number, and your social media accounts had all been deleted or changed to private. Damon was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the condensation from his beer bottle. I was angry, he said finally. After our fight, after you threw the ring, I wanted to start fresh. Clean slate, new city, new life, no reminders of what I'd lost. What you'd lost. The words came out sharper than she intended. You're the one who left, Damon. You're the one who chose your career over us. I chose my future, he corrected, his voice taking on an edge. Our future. The promotion in Seattle was the break I'd been waiting for my entire career. It was the chance to finally be the man you deserved, to give you the life you wanted. I never asked for a different life. The denial burst out of her before she could stop it. I loved our life. I loved our tiny apartment and our secondhand furniture and the way you made pancakes on Sunday mornings. I never needed you to be rich, Damon. I needed you to fight for us. Fight for us. His laugh was bitter. Cassandra, you literally threw your engagement ring at my head and told me you never wanted to see me again. What exactly was I supposed to fight? The memory hung between them, sharp and painful. That morning had started with such hope. Damon excitedly telling her about the promotion, about the apartment his new company would help them find, about the life they could build together in Seattle. It had ended with tears and harsh words, and the sound of the door slamming behind him. I was scared, she whispered, the admission feeling like pulling shards of glass from her throat. The promotion meant you'd be traveling constantly, working 18-hour days. I felt like I was already losing you to your ambition, and Seattle felt like the final nail in the coffin. So you ended it first. His voice was soft, understanding, but the hurt was still there underneath. You decided we were over before we even tried to make it work. Cassandra closed her eyes, remembering the pregnancy test she had taken 3 days after their fight. 2 pink lines that had changed everything, that had made her desperate to find him, to tell him, to try again. But by then he was gone, unreachable, and her pride had kept her from trying harder. I found out I was pregnant 3 days after you left, she said. 3 days. If I had just waited, if I had been a little less proud, a little less scared, we would have figured it out, Damon finished quietly. We would have made it work. The certainty in his voice broke something open inside her chest. Would we have? Really? Or would I have just been another obligation? Another thing keeping you from becoming who you were meant to be? Is that really what you think of me? His voice was incredulous. That I would have seen our children as obligations? That I would have resented them? Resented you? Before she could answer, her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Kids are asleep, Luke asked when Damon is coming back. Should I be prepared for more questions tomorrow? Cassandra showed him the message, watching his face soften as he read it. He likes you, she said unnecessarily. He's incredible. They both are. Damon's voice was thick with emotion. Luke has your curiosity, your way of asking questions that make you think. And Violet, she has this quiet strength. She watches everything, takes it all in before she decides if it's safe. Like you, Cassandra said without thinking, then felt heat rise in her cheeks. I mean, you always did that. Observed before you acted. Did I? He seemed genuinely surprised by the observation. I never thought of myself as particularly cautious. You were careful with people's feelings, careful with trust. It was one of the things She stopped herself before she could complete the sentence, but he was watching her intently. One of the things you what? One of the things I loved about you, she finished quietly. The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. 3 years of separation, 3 years of building different lives. But in that moment, Cassandra could feel the ghost of what they had been together. The easy intimacy that had once made her feel like she could tell him anything. I've thought about you, Damon said suddenly, more than I probably should have. I've wondered if you were happy, if you'd found someone else, if you ever thought about our last night together. Cassandra's breath caught. Their last night together had been 3 days before the fight, when they had made love with desperate intensity, as if some part of them had known their time was running out. It was the night Luke and Violet had been conceived, though neither of them had known it at the time. Every day, she whispered. I've thought about it every day. He reached across the table then, his fingers barely touching hers, but the contact sent electricity shooting up her arm. His hands were different now, softer, well manicured, bearing the subtle calluses that came from expensive gym equipment rather than manual labor. But his touch was still achingly familiar. I'm not the same man who left 3 years ago, he said quietly. The company I work for now, I own it, Cassandra. I built it from nothing after I got to Seattle. I have houses in 3 cities, more money than I know what to do with, and a life that looks perfect from the outside. She waited, sensing there was more. But none of it means anything, he continued, his thumb tracing across her knuckles. None of it fills the space you left behind. And now, knowing about Luke and Violet, knowing I've missed so much, what do you want from me? She asked, the question barely audible. What do you want from us? I want to be their father, he said immediately. I want to learn their favorite foods and their bedtime routines and the faces they make when they're trying not to laugh. I want to teach Luke how to throw a baseball and help Violet overcome whatever she's afraid of. I want to be there for the next 3 years, and the 3 years after that, and all the years that follow. And me? The question slipped out before she could stop it, vulnerable and revealing. What about me? Damon was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as if he were trying to memorize every detail. I still love you, he said finally, the words falling between them like stones into still water. I never stopped loving you, Cassandra. I tried, believe me, I tried, but you're in my bones, in my blood. You're the reason nothing else has ever worked. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. 3 years of loneliness and regret and desperate hope finally finding release. I love you too, she whispered. I've loved you through every sleepless night, every first word, every moment I wished you were there to see what our children were becoming. He moved to the chair beside her then, pulling her into his arms the way he had 1,000 times before. She fit against him perfectly, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder as if no time had passed at all. He smelled different, expensive cologne instead of drugstore soap, but underneath it all he was still fundamentally Damon, still the man who had once been her entire world. We can't just pick up where we left off, she said against his shirt, even as she melted into his embrace. Too much has changed. We've both changed. I know, he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. But we can start over. We can build something new, something better, something that can hold all of us, you, me, Luke, Violet. A real family. The word hung between them, full of promise and possibility. Family. It was what she had always wanted, what she had been too proud and too scared to fight for 3 years ago. And now, on Christmas Eve, in a nearly empty hotel bar, it felt like maybe, just maybe, they might get a second chance to get it right. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of crisp, clear brightness that made everything look like a postcard. Cassandra stood at the window of her parents' guest room, watching Luke and Violet play in the backyard snow, while her father helped them build what appeared to be the world's most lopsided snowman. The children's laughter carried through the glass, pure and infectious, a sound that should have filled her with uncomplicated joy. Instead, she felt the familiar knot of anxiety that had kept her awake most of the night. Damon was coming for Christmas dinner in 2 hours, and she had no idea how to navigate the delicate dance of introducing him as more than just Mama's friend, without overwhelming Luke and Violet with concepts they weren't ready to understand. You're overthinking again. Her mother appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Margaret Hayes was a small woman with prematurely gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, the kind of mother who could diagnose both physical and emotional ailments from across a room. I can practically hear the gears turning from downstairs. I don't know how to do this, Mom. Cassandra accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. How do I tell them that Damon is their father? How do I explain why he wasn't here before without making them think it was their fault? Margaret settled into the window seat beside her daughter, following her gaze to the children outside, the same way you explain everything else to them, with love, patience, and age-appropriate honesty. They're smart kids, Cassie, but they're also resilient. Children adapt better than adults do, especially when they feel secure. What if they don't like him? What if they're confused or scared? What if they love him? Margaret countered gently. What if this is exactly what they've been missing without even knowing it? Before Cassandra could respond, the doorbell rang. Through the window, she could see Damon's car in the driveway. Not the sleek sports car she might have expected, but a practical SUV with enough room for car seats and all the paraphernalia that came with small children. The sight of it made something tight in her chest loosen slightly. He's early, she said unnecessarily. Good. It means he's nervous too. Margaret stood, smoothing her holiday sweater with practiced composure. Why don't you get the door? I'll bring the kids in to wash up. Cassandra made her way downstairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the frosted glass of the front door, she could see Damon's silhouette, and for a moment she was transported back to their first apartment, to lazy Sunday mornings when he would bring her coffee in bed, and they would plan their entire future in whispered conversations. She opened the door to find him standing on the porch with his arms full of wrapped packages, looking simultaneously confident and uncertain in a way that was achingly familiar. He wore dark jeans and a forest green sweater that brought out his eyes, clothes that were undoubtedly expensive but looked approachably casual. More importantly, he looked like someone who belonged at a family Christmas, not like the intimidating billionaire she had encountered on the plane. Hi, he said, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. I may have gone a little overboard with the presents. A little? Cassandra stepped aside to let him in, eyeing the stack of gifts that threatened to topple from his arms. Damon, they're 2.5. They're going to be more interested in the boxes than whatever's inside them. I know. He trailed off, looking suddenly vulnerable. I've missed 2 Christmases, 2 birthdays. I have 3 years of gift-giving to make up for. The admission made her throat tight. She helped him stack the presents under the tree, noting that each gift was carefully labeled in handwriting she didn't recognize, probably purchased and wrapped by some assistant, but the thought behind them was clearly his own. You didn't have to do this, she said quietly. Yes, I did. He straightened, turning to face her fully. I know I can't buy my way into their hearts, but I needed to do something, to show them that I'm thinking about them, that I want to be here. Before she could respond, the sound of small feet thundering down the hallway announced the children's arrival. Luke burst into the living room first, still flushed from the cold and excitement, with Violet close behind clutching her omnipresent elephant. Damon! Luke shouted with the uninhibited enthusiasm that only children possessed. Did you see our snowman? Papa says it looks like it has chicken pox, but I think it looks good. I did see it, Damon said, crouching down to Luke's eye level with an ease that suggested he had spent considerable time thinking about how to interact with small children. I think it's the finest snowman I've ever seen. Very artistic. Violet approached more cautiously, hanging back near Cassandra's legs while studying this man who seemed to make her mama both happy and nervous. Damon noticed her hesitation and didn't push, instead remaining at Luke's level and letting her observe at her own pace. Hi, Violet, he said softly. I like your elephant. What's his name? It's a her, Violet corrected with the gentle firmness of someone setting the record straight. Her name is Eleanor. She likes Christmas, but she doesn't like loud noises. Eleanor is a beautiful name for a beautiful elephant, Damon said seriously. I'll make sure to keep my voice quiet so she feels comfortable. The consideration in his tone seemed to win Violet over, and she took a tentative step closer. Did you bring presents? I did bring presents, Damon confirmed, glancing at Cassandra for permission before continuing. But first I wanted to ask you and Luke something important. Would it be okay if I spent Christmas with your family today? Luke nodded enthusiastically. Yes. Mama says Christmas is better with more people to love. The innocent statement hit Damon like a physical blow, and Cassandra saw his composure waver for just a moment before he recovered. Your mama is very smart, he said thickly. I think she's right about that. The next hour passed in a blur of wrapping paper and delighted squeals. Damon had indeed gone overboard. Educational toys that encouraged creativity, books with beautiful illustrations, clothes in the perfect sizes that suggested he had done his research. But the gifts that seemed to mean the most were the simple ones. A set of colored pencils for Luke, who loved to draw, and a smaller elephant to keep Eleanor company for Violet. Cassandra's parents watched the proceedings with the careful attention of people trying to assess a complicated situation. Her father, Robert, engaged Damon in conversation about his business, while her mother observed how he interacted with the children. Both seemed cautiously optimistic, though Cassandra could see the questions in their eyes. It wasn't until Luke crawled into Damon's lap with a new book that the moment Cassandra had been dreading finally arrived. Damon, Luke said, his small hands tracing the illustrations on the page. Are you going to be our daddy now? The living room fell silent except for the crackling of logs in the fireplace. Violet looked up from where she had been arranging Eleanor and her new companion, suddenly alert to the gravity of the conversation. Cassandra's parents exchanged meaningful glances, while Cassandra herself felt her heart stop beating entirely. Damon was very still for a long moment, his hand resting gently on Luke's back. When he spoke, his voice was careful and honest. I would like to be if that's okay with you and Violet and your mama, but being a daddy is a very important job and I want to make sure I do it right. What does a daddy do? Violet asked, moving closer to the couch where they sat. A daddy loves his children no matter what, Damon said, his eyes finding Cassandra's across the room. He takes care of them and protects them and helps them learn about the world. He reads bedtime stories and kisses scraped knees and teaches them important things like how to be kind to others. Luke considered this seriously. Do you know how to read bedtime stories? I'm still learning, Damon admitted, but I'm a very good student. I could teach you, Luke offered generously. I know all the best voices for the characters. I would like that very much, Damon said, his voice thick with emotion. Violet had been listening intently, and now she approached the couch with her characteristic caution. "If you're our daddy, do you live with us?" The question struck at the heart of the practical complications they hadn't yet discussed. Cassandra felt her parents' attention sharpen, waiting to see how this fundamental issue would be addressed. "Right now, I live in a different city," Damon said carefully. "But daddies and mamas and children should live together, so we'll have to figure out how to make that work. It might take some time to arrange everything, but I promise you that we'll work it out." It was a politician's answer, carefully crafted to be truthful without being specific, but the children seemed satisfied. Luke had already moved on to asking Damon to read the new book, while Violet was arranging her elephants in what appeared to be a complex family structure. As Damon's voice filled the room, reading about brave knights and clever princesses, Cassandra found herself imagining what their life might look like if they could make this work. Sunday mornings with pancakes and bedtime stories, scraped knees kissed and homework supervised, family vacations and quiet evenings at home. It was everything she had once dreamed of, everything she had given up hope of having. And sitting in her parents' living room on Christmas morning, watching the man she loved read to their children while snow fell outside the windows, it felt almost within reach. The only question now was whether they could navigate the practical realities of building a life together, or whether the complications of merging their separate worlds would prove too much for their fragile new beginning to survive. The call came at 7:30 that evening, just as Cassandra was giving Luke and Violet their baths. Damon's phone buzzed insistently from where he had left it on the kitchen counter, and after the fifth ring, Cassandra's father answered it with the resigned politeness of a man trying to help. "Prescott residence," Robert said, then paused. "Oh, I'm sorry. He's not available right now. May I take a message?" Cassandra could hear the tension in her father's voice from upstairs, could sense that something was wrong. She quickly wrapped Violet in a towel and carried her to the top of the stairs, Luke padding behind them in his dinosaur pajamas. "I understand," her father was saying, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes, I'll give him the message immediately." Damon appeared at the bottom of the stairs, his expression shifting from relaxed contentment to sharp alertness as he took in Robert's face. "What is it?" "Your assistant," Robert said, handing him the phone. "She says it's urgent." Damon took the phone with an apologetic glance at Cassandra. "Miranda? What's—" "No, I told you I was taking the week off." His voice was low, but in the acoustics of the old house, every word carried clearly. "I don't care what the Tokyo office thinks. The merger can wait until after New Year's." Cassandra felt something cold settle in her stomach as she listened to the one-sided conversation. This was the world Damon lived in now. International mergers, urgent calls on Christmas night, assistants who expected him to be available 24 hours a day. It was everything she had feared when he first told her about the promotion that took him to Seattle. "No, absolutely not," Damon was saying, his voice taking on the hard edge of authority. "I don't care if they threaten to walk. Some things are more important than money." But even as he said the words, Cassandra could see the tension building in his shoulders, could see him mentally cataloging the problems that were piling up in his absence. This was a man accustomed to being in control, to solving problems before they became crises, and every minute he spent away from his business empire was another minute for things to go wrong. Luke tugged on her hand. "Mama, why is Damon talking so angry?" "He's not angry, sweetheart," Cassandra said softly, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "He's just talking about work." "Does he have to go to work now?" Violet asked, her thumb finding its way to her mouth in the way it always did when she sensed adult stress. Before Cassandra could answer, Damon ended the call and looked up at them with an expression that was part frustration, part apology. "I'm sorry about that. There's a situation in Tokyo that my team thinks requires immediate attention." On Christmas, Margaret Hayes appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel with the kind of measured disapproval that only mothers could master. "Business doesn't observe holidays," Damon said automatically, then seemed to hear how that sounded. "But that doesn't mean I have to respond to every crisis. I've built a good team precisely so I can step away when I need to." The word sounded rehearsed, like something he told himself to justify a lifestyle that left little room for anything but work. Cassandra recognized the tone because she had heard it before, 3 years ago, when late nights at the office had become routine and weekend trips had been canceled for urgent projects that never seemed to end. "Let me get these two ready for bed," she said quietly, gathering Luke and Violet's pajamas. "We can talk after they're settled." But as she helped the children brush their teeth and choose bedtime stories, Damon's phone rang twice more. Each time he stepped outside to take the call, his voice carrying through the thin windows as he managed crises half a world away. By the time Luke and Violet were tucked into their temporary beds, the relaxed family atmosphere of the evening had evaporated. Cassandra found Damon in the living room, pacing in front of the dying fire while he typed rapidly on his phone. The Christmas tree lights cast warm shadows across his face, but his expression was all business. The same focused intensity she remembered from their last months together, when work had gradually consumed more and more of his attention. "How bad is it?" she asked. He looked up, seeming almost surprised to see her there. "What? Oh, the Tokyo thing. It's complicated. The merger we've been working on for 6 months is falling apart because one of their executives had a family emergency and won't be available to sign the papers until next week. My team thinks we should fly there immediately to smooth things over." "And are you going to fly there?" The question hung between them, loaded with 3 years of history and the fragile hope they had been building over the past 24 hours. Damon set his phone down on the coffee table, but Cassandra could see his fingers twitching toward it, drawn by the constant stream of messages and calls demanding his attention. "No," he said firmly. "Absolutely not. This is more important." But even as he said it, his phone buzzed again, and again. The sound filled the quiet room like an accusation, a reminder of all the responsibilities and expectations he carried, all the people who depended on him to make decisions and solve problems and generate the billions of dollars that had become his identity. "Damon," Cassandra said softly, "you can take the calls. I understand." "I don't want you to understand," he said, his voice sharp with frustration. "I want this to be different. I want to be different." "But you're not, are you?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. 3 years of fear and resentment finally finding voice. "You're still the same man who chose work over everything else. You've just gotten better at justifying it." "That's not fair." Damon's voice was defensive, but there was something underneath it that might have been guilt. "Everything I've built, everything I've achieved, it's all so I can provide for the people I love. So I can give you and Luke and Violet a life where you never have to worry about money or security." "We don't need your money," Cassandra said quietly. "We need you, present, available, choosing us over whatever crisis is happening in Tokyo or London or wherever. But I'm starting to think that's not who you are anymore." The accusation hit its mark. Damon's face went pale, and for a moment he looked like the uncertain young man she had fallen in love with, before success had armored him in confidence and expensive suits. "I can change," he said. "I can learn to delegate more, to trust my team to handle things without me." "Can you?" Cassandra challenged. "Because your phone has rung 6 times in the last hour, and each time you've answered it. Each time you've let work interrupt our family time. How is that different from 3 years ago?" Before he could answer, his phone rang again. They both looked at it, lying on the coffee table between them like a test neither of them wanted to take. Damon reached for it automatically, then stopped, his hand hovering over the device as he seemed to realize what he was doing. "Let it go to voicemail," Cassandra said. "Show me that we, matter more than whatever crisis they think they need you to solve." The phone continued ringing, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Damon's jaw was tight, his whole body radiating tension as he fought against every instinct that had made him successful. The ringing stopped, and for a moment there was blessed silence. Then it started again. "Jesus," Damon muttered, running his hands through his hair. "I can't just ignore my responsibilities, Cassandra. I have 500 employees depending on me, investors who trust me with their money, deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars that could fall apart if I'm not available to manage them. And we have 2 children upstairs who are just starting to believe they might have a father," Cassandra shot back. "Children who heard you promise to put them first, to be the daddy they've never had. But the first time your business demands your attention, you're already wavering." The truth of the accusation was written across Damon's face, and Cassandra felt her heart break a little as she realized that nothing had really changed. Success had made him wealthier, more powerful, more confident, but it hadn't solved the fundamental problem that had destroyed their relationship the first time. He was still a man who didn't know how to be present, how to choose love over ambition, how to build a life that had room for anything but work. "I love you," he said desperately. "I love all of you, but I can't just walk away from everything I've built. There has to be a middle ground, a way to have both." "There is," Cassandra said sadly, "but it requires you to actually choose us." not just say you're choosing us. And I don't think you know how to do that anymore." His phone had stopped ringing, but the damage was done. The spell of Christmas morning, the fantasy of a happy family, the hope that they could build something real together, it all felt impossibly fragile now, threatened by the very success that was supposed to make their reunion possible. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the quiet suburban street in pristine white. But inside the warm house where their children slept peacefully upstairs, Cassandra and Damon faced the same impossible choice that had torn them apart 3 years ago. Love or ambition, family or success, the life they wanted, or the life they had built separately. And this time, there were 2 small hearts at stake, 2 children who had already begun to hope for something their parents might not be able to give them after all. The guest room was dark except for the pale glow of streetlights filtering through sheer curtains. Cassandra lay awake listening to Luke and Violet's steady breathing from the twin beds across the room, her mind replaying every moment of the evening's confrontation. Downstairs, she could hear Damon's voice through the floorboards, low, urgent, still managing crises that couldn't wait until morning. It was 3 in the morning on December 26th, and he was still working. She had left him in the living room 2 hours ago, unable to watch him pace and gesture while he talked to executives in Tokyo about market fluctuations and contract negotiations. The conversation they needed to have, about boundaries, about priorities, about whether he was capable of the changes he claimed to want, had been postponed indefinitely in favor of business that apparently couldn't wait. Her phone buzzed quietly on the nightstand. A text message from an unknown number. "This is Miranda, Mr. Prescott's assistant. He asked me to let you know he'll be taking calls until approximately 5 a.m. your time. He wants you to know how sorry he is, and that he'll explain everything tomorrow." Cassandra stared at the message until the words blurred together. Even his apologies came through an assistant now. Even his regret was managed by someone else, scheduled and delegated like every other aspect of his carefully controlled life. She slipped out of bed and padded quietly to the window, looking down at the backyard where Luke and Violet had played in the snow just hours before. Their lopsided snowman stood sentinel in the moonlight, a reminder of the simple joy that had filled the day before reality intruded. "Mama?" Violet's sleepy voice made her turn. Her daughter was sitting up in bed, clutching Eleanor against her chest. "Why are you sad?" "I'm not sad, sweetheart," Cassandra whispered, moving to sit on the edge of Violet's bed. "Just thinking." "Is Damon still here?" Violet asked with the intuitive understanding that sometimes frightened Cassandra with its accuracy. "He's still here. But he's going to leave, isn't he?" Violet's thumb found its way to her mouth, like daddies do in the movies. The innocent observation cut deeper than any accusation Damon might have thrown at her. Cassandra smoothed Violet's dark hair, so much like her own, and tried to find words that were honest without being devastating. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult choices," she said carefully, "and sometimes those choices mean they can't be together the way they want to be." "Because of work?" "Because of work," Cassandra confirmed, surprised by her daughter's perception. Violet considered this with the serious expression she wore when processing complex information. "Luke's going to be sad," she said finally. "He likes Damon." "I know he does. Do you like Damon?" The question was simple, but the answer felt impossibly complicated. Did she like the man who had read bedtime stories and built snowmen and promised to learn how to be a father? Or did she like the memory of who he used to be, before success had consumed him? Did she love the person he claimed he could become, or was she holding on to an illusion that had never really existed? "It's complicated, baby girl," she said finally. Violet seemed to accept this as a reasonable adult response and lay back down, but she didn't close her eyes. "Will you stay with us always?" she asked quietly. "Always," Cassandra promised, the certainty in her voice surprising even herself. "No matter what happens with anyone else, you and Luke and I will always be together. That's never going to change." Violet smiled and closed her eyes, but Cassandra remained sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall and listening to the murmur of Damon's voice from downstairs. The sound should have been comforting, proof that he was still here, still trying to balance his 2 worlds. Instead, it felt like evidence that some problems couldn't be solved with good intentions and honest conversations. She must have dozed because the next thing she knew, pale winter sunlight was streaming through the windows and Luke was tugging on her sleeve. "Mama, Damon's sleeping on the couch," he announced with the fascination children reserved for anything outside the normal routine. "Grandpa says he worked all night like a superhero." Cassandra felt a familiar stab of irritation at her father's well-meaning attempt to frame Damon's workaholism as something admirable. She found her robe and followed Luke downstairs, where the smell of coffee and bacon suggested her mother was already well into her morning routine. Damon was indeed asleep on the couch, still wearing yesterday's clothes, his phone clutched in one hand, and his laptop balanced precariously on the coffee table. Dark circles under his eyes and the stubble shadowing his jaw told the story of a night spent managing emergencies that couldn't wait for business hours in Seattle. He finished around 5:30, Margaret said quietly, appearing at Cassandra's elbow with a fresh cup of coffee. I heard him finally hang up and come in from the porch. Poor thing looked exhausted. Poor thing? Cassandra couldn't keep the edge from her voice. Mom, he chose to spend Christmas night on the phone instead of with his family. That's not something that happened to him. It's something he decided was more important than us. Is it? Margaret's tone was carefully neutral, but Cassandra knew that voice. It was the same one her mother had used when Cassandra was 16 and declaring that she was dropping out of high school to follow a boy to California. Or is it possible that there's more to the situation than you're seeing? Before Cassandra could respond, Damon stirred on the couch, his eyes opening slowly as he took in his surroundings. For just a moment he looked confused, disoriented, like a man who had forgotten where he was and how he had gotten there. Cassandra, he said, struggling to sit up. His voice was hoarse from hours of talking. I'm sorry. I never meant for that to happen. The situation in Tokyo was... I don't want to hear about Tokyo, Cassandra interrupted. I want to hear about us, about Luke and Violet and whether you're actually capable of putting them first when it matters. Damon ran his hands through his disheveled hair, and she could see him struggling to find words that would bridge the gap between his intentions and his actions. The deal fell apart, he said finally. 6 months of work, hundreds of millions of dollars gone because I wasn't available to manage the crisis when it happened. And that's more important than your children's bedtime stories? No, he said immediately. God, no. But Cassandra, you have to understand. I have responsibilities that go beyond what I want personally. I have employees whose jobs depend on these deals going through. I have investors who trust me with their money. I can't just walk away from all of that. I'm not asking you to walk away from all of that, Cassandra said, her voice rising despite her efforts to keep it low. I'm asking you to find a balance. To hire people you trust to handle emergencies so you don't have to be available 24 hours a day. To build a life that has room for something other than work. You make it sound so simple. It is simple, she shot back. It's just not easy. And you've gotten so comfortable being indispensable that you can't imagine a world where you're not personally managing every crisis. Luke appeared in the doorway, still in his dinosaur pajamas, drawn by the sound of raised voices. He looked from Cassandra to Damon with the worried expression children wore when the adults in their world were fighting. Are you leaving now? He asked Damon directly, his small voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Damon's composure cracked completely. He looked at Luke, really looked at him, taking in the sandy brown hair that stuck up in the back, the green eyes that were so much like his own, the hopeful expression that was slowly shifting toward disappointment. I don't want to leave, Damon said quietly, but your mama thinks I'm not good at being here. You could practice, Luke suggested with the earnest problem-solving attitude of a toddler, like when I practice tying my shoes. Mama says practice makes it easier. The simple statement hung in the air between them, and Cassandra felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. She looked at Damon, saw the pain in his eyes, the genuine struggle between what he wanted and what he had trained himself to believe was necessary. Maybe the problem wasn't that he didn't love them enough. Maybe the problem was that he didn't believe he deserved to have both. The success he had worked so hard to achieve and the family he had lost along the way. Damon, she said, her voice softer now. What are you afraid of? The question caught him off guard. What? What are you afraid will happen if you're not available every minute? If you delegate responsibility and trust other people to make decisions, what's the worst thing that could happen? He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him considering the question seriously. I'll lose everything, he said finally. I'll make the wrong choice, or miss the crucial moment, and everything I've built will fall apart. And then what? And then I'll have nothing to offer you. Nothing to give Luke and Violet. I'll be nobody again, just the guy who had potential but couldn't deliver when it mattered. The admission was raw, honest, and heartbreaking. Cassandra realized with sudden clarity that Damon's workaholism wasn't about arrogance or ambition. It was about fear. Fear that without his success, without his ability to solve problems and generate wealth and be indispensable, he would be worthless. Oh, Damon, she whispered, moving toward the couch where he sat slumped forward, his head in his hands. Is that really what you think? That your worth is tied to your net worth? Isn't it? He looked up at her, and she saw the uncertain young man she had fallen in love with, still hiding underneath all the layers of success and confidence. What else do I have to offer? Luke, who had been listening to this exchange with the intense focus he usually reserved for construction equipment, walked over and climbed onto the couch beside Damon. You're good at reading stories, he said seriously, settling himself against Damon's side with the casual affection that came naturally to children. And you know about airplanes. And you smell nice. And you make mama happy. The simple list of virtues that had nothing to do with money or power or business success made Damon's eyes fill with tears. He wrapped his arm around Luke, holding him close, and looked at Cassandra with an expression of wonder and terror. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to be a father or a partner or anything other than what I've become. I'm terrified I'll fail at this too, and this time the stakes are too high. This time, if I mess up, I lose everything that actually matters. Cassandra sat down on his other side, close enough to feel his warmth, close enough to see the vulnerability he had spent years learning to hide. You won't do it perfectly, she said quietly. Nobody does. But you don't have to choose between being successful and being present. You just have to choose us first, consistently, and trust that everything else will work itself out. What if it doesn't? Then we'll figure it out together, she said, the words feeling like a promise she wasn't sure she was ready to make. But we can't even try if you're not willing to take the risk. Violet appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of serious adult conversation, and climbed onto the couch on Luke's other side. For a moment, they sat in silence. 4 people who could be a family if they were brave enough to choose each other over their fears. I want to try, Damon said finally. But I'm going to need help. I'm going to need patience. And I'm probably going to screw up more than once while I figure this out. Cassandra looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the billionaire who had intimidated her with his success, but the man she had loved enough to build a life with, who was offering to risk everything for a chance to build that life again. Okay, she said quietly. Let's try. 2 weeks later, Cassandra stood in the doorway of a sprawling house in the Denver suburbs, watching Luke and Violet explore what Damon had called a temporary solution, but looked suspiciously like a permanent investment. The house was beautiful, not ostentatious but spacious and warm, with a backyard that seemed designed for children and a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine. The lease is month to month, Damon said, appearing beside her with coffee and the slightly nervous energy that had become his constant companion since Christmas morning. I know it seems like a lot, but I wanted Luke and Violet to have space to run around while we figure out the logistics. Logistics. It was a word that had featured heavily in their conversations over the past 2 weeks, as they navigated the complicated reality of blending 2 lives that had evolved separately for 3 years. Where to live, where the children would go to school, how to split time between Denver and Seattle, how to manage Damon's business responsibilities while building a family life. It's perfect, Cassandra said honestly, watching Luke discover a reading nook built into the bay window of what would be his bedroom. But Damon, we need to talk about the money. They had been dancing around this conversation for days. Damon's solution to every practical problem involved spending money. The house, private school applications for the twins, a nanny to help during his travel days, a financial planner to set up college funds. His generosity was overwhelming and, if she was honest, a little insulting. I know you're uncomfortable with it, he said, settling into the window seat where Luke had abandoned his exploration in favor of a new children's book. But Cassandra, I want to provide for them, for all of you. Isn't that what fathers do? Fathers also change diapers and kiss scraped knees and show up for school plays, she replied, keeping her voice light but pointed. Money is the easy part, Damon. It's everything else that's going to be the challenge. As if summoned by their conversation, Damon's phone buzzed against the coffee table. He glanced at it automatically, then made a visible effort to leave it alone. It was a small victory, but Cassandra recognized the discipline it required. Over the past 2 weeks, she had watched him struggle with the simple act of being present, of letting calls go to voicemail, of trusting his team to handle problems without his immediate input. Miranda's setting up meetings for next week, he said, referring to the assistant who had become their unlikely ally in this transition. I'm flying to Seattle on Tuesday to restructure some responsibilities, hire a COO who can handle day-to-day operations. And Thursday you have dinner with the twins' pediatrician, Cassandra added. consulting the shared calendar they had created to manage their increasingly complex schedule. Friday is Luke's evaluation for the preschool program. The mundane details of family life looked strange written alongside board meetings and investor calls, but they were learning to weave them together. Slowly, carefully, with more than a few stumbles along the way. Violet appeared in the kitchen doorway, clutching Eleanor and wearing the serious expression that meant she had something important to say. "Damon, can you help me reach the books on the tall shelf?" "Of course," he said, setting down his coffee immediately. Cassandra watched him crouch to Violet's level, asking her which books she wanted, taking the time to explain the organization system even though she was too young to really understand it. These small moments had become precious to her, evidence that he was learning, that he was trying to become the father Luke and Violet deserved. But they were also fragile, easily disrupted by the demands of his other life, the empire he had built that still required constant attention. "Mama, look!" Luke's voice carried from the backyard where he had discovered a tire swing hanging from an old oak tree. "Can I try it?" "Let me help you," Damon called, moving toward the back door with the kind of automatic response that had developed over the past 2 weeks. The sight of him pushing Luke on the swing, both of them laughing as snow continued to dust the frozen ground, made something tight in Cassandra's chest finally loosen. Her phone rang, her supervisor at the hospital asking about her schedule for the following week. The NICU was short-staffed, and they needed her to pick up extra shifts. It was the kind of request she had never been able to refuse before, the guilt of leaving her colleagues in a difficult situation always outweighing her own needs. "I can't," she found herself saying, surprising them both. "I'm taking family leave for another week, maybe 2. After she hung up, she felt Damon watching her with a mixture of admiration and understanding. "That was hard for you," he observed. "Terrifying," she admitted. "I've never put my personal life ahead of work responsibilities. I'm not sure I know how to do this either." It was a realization that had been building over the past 2 weeks, that their problems weren't just about his inability to balance work and family. She had her own patterns of prioritizing duty over happiness, of believing that her worth was tied to how indispensable she made herself to others. "We're both learning," he said, moving to stand beside her at the window. Outside, Luke was teaching Violet how to pump her legs on the swing, their voices creating a soundtrack of pure joy. "The difference is, this time, we're learning together." His phone buzzed again, and this time he didn't even glance at it. It was such a small gesture, but it represented a fundamental shift in priorities that had taken weeks of conscious effort to develop. "I have something to tell you," Damon said suddenly, his voice taking on the careful tone he used when delivering potentially difficult news. "The Tokyo deal? The one that fell apart over Christmas? My team restructured it without me. Turns out they didn't need me to fly halfway around the world to fix it after all." Cassandra felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth. "Imagine that. I'm starting to think I might have overestimated my own indispensability," he admitted, with the kind of rueful honesty that had been emerging more frequently. "It's possible that the company can function without my personal involvement in every decision." "Revolutionary thinking," she teased, but gently. She knew how difficult it was for him to let go of control, to trust others with responsibilities he had carried alone for so long. Violet had grown tired of the swing, and was now building a snow fort with Luke, their mittened hands patting snow into walls with the kind of focused determination that only children brought to their projects. Watching them, Cassandra could almost see the family they were becoming. Not the perfect immediate transformation she might have fantasized about, but the messy, gradual, real process of learning to choose each other every day. "I want to ask you something," Damon said, his voice taking on a different quality. "And I want you to think about it before you answer, because I know it's a big decision." Cassandra felt her heart skip, uncertain what was coming but sensing its importance. "Move in with me," he said quietly. "Not just for the logistics, not just for Luke and Violet, but because I want to build a life with you. A real life, with morning coffee and bedtime stories and all the ordinary, extraordinary moments that make a family." The proposal was simple, practical, and absolutely terrifying. Moving in together would mean giving up the careful independence she had built over the past 3 years, trusting him not just with her heart, but with the daily reality of their children's lives. "I'm scared," she said honestly. "What if this doesn't work? What if you get pulled back into the old patterns, or I can't adjust to this new life, or the kids get hurt when it falls apart? Then we'll figure it out," he said, echoing her own words from Christmas morning. "But Cassandra, I've spent 3 years trying to build a life without you, and I've learned something important. Success means nothing if you have no one to share it with. I don't want to be successful anymore. I want to be happy, and I can't be happy without you." Through the window, Luke and Violet were calling for them to come outside, to see their snow fort, to help them build a snow family to keep their lopsided snowman company. Their voices were bright with excitement, full of the assumption that the adults in their world would choose to join their game, rather than stand inside discussing complicated grown-up problems. "Okay," Cassandra said, the word feeling like stepping off a cliff and growing wings at the same time. "Let's try building a life together." Damon's smile was brilliant, transformative, the same expression she remembered from the morning he had proposed years ago with a ring he had saved for months to buy. But this time was different. This time they both understood the difference between grand romantic gestures and the daily choice to love each other through ordinary moments and extraordinary challenges. "Should we go help them build a snow family?" he asked, gesturing toward the window where Luke and Violet were waving enthusiastically. "I think that sounds perfect," Cassandra replied, and for the first time in 3 years, she believed that it actually might be. 6 months later, on a warm June morning that marked Luke and Violet's 3rd birthday, everything almost fell apart. Cassandra woke to the sound of hushed, urgent voices drifting up from the kitchen of their Denver home. She had learned to recognize the tone. It was the same voice Damon used when his business world collided with their carefully constructed family life, when decisions worth millions of dollars demanded immediate attention, while birthday pancakes waited on the griddle. Through the monitor, she could hear Luke and Violet chattering excitedly in their room, already awake and anticipating their special day. They had been planning this birthday for weeks. A small party in the backyard with their grandparents and a few friends from preschool. Nothing elaborate, but everything they had requested. 3-year-olds, it turned out, had very specific ideas about proper birthday celebrations. "I understand the timeline," Damon was saying into his phone, his voice carrying the edge of frustration that had become increasingly rare over the past months. "But today is not negotiable. Whatever Shanghai needs can wait until tomorrow." Cassandra felt her stomach tighten. Shanghai. That meant the international acquisition he had been working on for the past month. The deal that was supposed to cement his company's expansion into Asian markets. The deal he had promised would be the last major project requiring his hands-on management before he transitioned to a purely advisory role. She found him in the kitchen, still in his pajamas but fully focused on whatever crisis was unfolding half a world away. His laptop was open on the counter beside a mixing bowl full of pancake batter, the domestic and professional sides of his life creating an incongruous tableau. "No," he was saying firmly, "I'm not flying to Shanghai today. My children are turning 3, and I promised them I would be here." The words should have reassured her, but Cassandra could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his free hand was already reaching for his laptop. This was the moment she had been dreading for months. The test that would determine whether their carefully rebuilt relationship could survive when his two worlds truly collided. "Damon," she said softly, not wanting to interrupt, but needing to understand the scope of the crisis. He looked up, covering the phone with his hand. "The Shanghai investors are threatening to walk if I don't fly out today to personally oversee the final negotiations. They're claiming it's a cultural issue, that they need to see my commitment to the partnership. And if they walk, 18 months of work down the drain, 40 million in development costs, layoffs in 3 different offices." His voice was flat, factual, but she could hear the weight of responsibility underneath. "It's not just about money, Cassandra. People's livelihoods are at stake." Before she could respond, Luke and Violet appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in their matching dinosaur pajamas, hair tousled from sleep and eyes bright with birthday excitement. "Daddy!" Luke shouted, launching himself at Damon with the absolute trust that had developed over the past months. "Is it pancake time? You promised special birthday pancakes." Violet followed more cautiously, but with equal enthusiasm, wrapping her arms around Damon's legs while he tried to balance the phone and return their hugs. "Are Grandma and Grandpa coming today?" she asked, thumb finding its way toward her mouth in the way that still emerged when she felt uncertain about adult emotions. "They're coming," Damon assured her, but Cassandra could see him glancing at his laptop screen where urgent messages were undoubtedly piling up from his team in Shanghai. "Mr. Prescott?" The voice from his phone was tinny but audible. "We need a decision within the hour if we're going to salvage this." Cassandra watched Damon's face, saw the exact moment when his business instincts warred with his family commitments. This was it, the defining moment that would determine not just the success of his deal, but the future of their relationship. Everything they had built over the past 6 months hung in the balance. "Luke, Violet," Cassandra said carefully, "why don't you go pick out your birthday outfits while Daddy finishes his call?" The children protested briefly, but were easily distracted by the promise of choosing their own clothes for such an important day. Once they were upstairs, Cassandra turned to face Damon fully, reading the conflict in his expression. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said quietly. "I'm thinking that 6 months ago I wouldn't have hesitated," he admitted. "I would have been on a plane within 2 hours, justified it as necessary for everyone's financial security, and figured out how to make it up to the kids later. And now? Now I'm thinking that there will always be another crisis, another deal that seems like it can't wait, another emergency that requires my personal attention. And if I get on that plane today, I'm teaching Luke and Violet that work will always come first when it really matters." The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Cassandra could see the genuine struggle in his eyes, the way years of conditioning warred with newly formed priorities. "But I'm also thinking about my employees in the Singapore office, about the families that depend on those jobs, about the commitments I've made to people who trusted me with their investments," he continued. "How do I weigh their needs against my children's birthday party?" It was the question that had no easy answer, the fundamental challenge that had destroyed their relationship once before. But something had changed in the past months, something fundamental in how he approached these impossible choices. "What does your gut tell you?" she asked. Damon was quiet for a long moment, listening to the sound of Luke and Violet's laughter drifting down from upstairs, the sound of children who trusted that their daddy would be there for their special day because he had promised, because he had never broken a promise to them yet. "My gut tells me that I've spent 3 years of my children's lives prioritizing other people's emergencies over my own family," he said slowly. "My gut tells me that if this deal is really that fragile, if it can't survive one day without my personal involvement, then maybe it's not the kind of partnership we want anyway." He lifted the phone back to his ear, and Cassandra held her breath. "Marcus," he said to whoever was on the other end, "I need you to take point on the Shanghai negotiations. Use the authority I gave you. Make whatever concessions you think are reasonable, and if the investors aren't satisfied with that, then we'll revisit the partnership next quarter." There was an eruption of voices from the phone. Protests, arguments, dire predictions about the consequences of his absence. Damon listened patiently for a moment, then cut through the noise with quiet authority. "I understand your concerns," he said calmly, "but I'm not available today. This is what delegation looks like, and it's what we're all going to have to get comfortable with if this company is going to evolve beyond requiring my personal involvement in every major decision." He ended the call and closed his laptop with a decisive snap, then looked at Cassandra with an expression that was equal parts terror and determination. "I might have just cost us $40 million, he said. "You might have," she agreed. "Or you might have just figured out what's actually priceless." Before he could respond, Luke and Violet thundered back down the stairs, now dressed in mismatched but carefully chosen birthday outfits. Luke in a superhero t-shirt and formal dress pants, Violet in a tutu and sneakers. "Pancakes now?" Luke asked hopefully. "Pancakes now," Damon confirmed, moving toward the stove with renewed purpose. Special birthday pancakes for special birthday kids. As he poured batter into the pan, his phone buzzed repeatedly on the counter. Messages from Shanghai, updates from his team, probably urgent requests for guidance on how to proceed without him. Damon glanced at the phone once, then deliberately turned it face down, and focused on flipping perfectly round pancakes while Luke and Violet provided enthusiastic commentary. Cassandra leaned against the counter, watching this man she loved choose their family over his empire, one small decision at a time. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about pancakes on a Tuesday morning, about being present for birthday parties, about trusting other people to handle crises so he could be available for the moments that mattered most. "Daddy," Violet said suddenly, climbing onto a stool beside the stove. "Are you sad about your work call?" The question caught Damon off guard, and Cassandra watched him consider how to answer with age-appropriate honesty. "A little," he said carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult choices between different important things. But you know what I realized?" "What?" both children asked in unison. "I realized that the most important things are the ones that can't wait. Work can always be done tomorrow, But today is your birthday and you're only going to turn 3 once in your whole lives. I don't want to miss that for anything." Luke nodded seriously, as if this made perfect sense to his 3-year-old logic. "Plus, you make the best pancakes," he added pragmatically. "Plus, I make the best pancakes," Damon agreed, grinning as he slid a perfect Mickey Mouse-shaped pancake onto Luke's plate. Hours later, after birthday songs and wrapping paper chaos and cake that was more frosting than actual cake, Cassandra found Damon on the back porch, finally checking the messages he had ignored all day. But instead of the tense, urgent energy she might have expected, he looked relaxed, almost amused. "How bad is it?" she asked, settling beside him on the swing they had installed in the spring. "Surprisingly good, actually," he said, showing her his phone screen. "Marcus handled the negotiations beautifully, better than I probably would have, honestly. The Shanghai investors were impressed by his preparation and decision-making authority. The deal is back on track, and it didn't require a single billionaire flying halfway around the world to save it." "Shocking," Cassandra said with mock surprise. "It's almost like you've hired competent people who are capable of doing their jobs without constant supervision." "Revolutionary concept," he admitted, echoing her words from months earlier. "I'm starting to think this delegation thing might actually work." Through the sliding glass door, they could see Luke and Violet in the living room, playing with their new toys while their grandparents cleaned up the remnants of the party. It was a scene of ordinary family happiness, the kind of moment that would have seemed impossibly precious during the years when Cassandra was raising them alone. "I need to tell you something," Damon said suddenly, his voice taking on a serious tone. "Today, when that call came in for about 30 seconds, I considered getting on that plane. Old habits, old instincts. The part of me that built this company was screaming that I was making a huge mistake." Cassandra felt her chest tighten, but she waited for him to continue. "But then I looked at Luke and Violet, saw how excited they were about their birthday, and I realized something fundamental had changed," he continued. "For the first time in my adult life, disappointing my business associates felt less important than disappointing my children. Not just intellectually, but in my bones. That's when I knew we were going to be okay." The simple statement carried the weight of months of struggle, of gradually relearned priorities, of choosing love over ambition, one decision at a time, until it became natural instead of forced. "We're going to be more than okay," Cassandra said, leaning into his warmth as the evening air grew cool around them. "We're going to be happy." Inside the house, Luke called out that he wanted Daddy to read him a bedtime story, and Damon stood immediately, automatically, without even glancing at his still buzzing phone. "Coming, buddy," he called back, then looked down at Cassandra with the kind of smile that made her remember why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. "Ready for the best part of the day?" "Bedtime stories?" she asked. "Family time," he corrected, reaching out his hand to help her up. "All of us together, exactly where we belong." As they walked back into the house hand in hand, Cassandra realized that this was what happily ever after actually looked like. Not a dramatic conclusion, but a quiet evening full of ordinary magic, with the promise of countless more evenings just like it stretching out ahead of them. 5 years later, the morning light filtered through the gauze curtains of the master bedroom, casting soft shadows across hardwood floors that bore the scuff marks of small feet and larger adventures. Cassandra Hayes Prescott stretched luxuriously in the king-sized bed, listening to the familiar sounds of her family beginning another day downstairs, the clatter of cereal bowls, the excited chatter of 8-year-old twins, and Damon's patient voice explaining why syrup was not an appropriate topping for everything. 5 years. Had it really been 5 years since that Christmas Eve flight that changed everything? Sometimes it felt like a lifetime, and sometimes like yesterday. The house around her was different now. Not the temporary rental they had started with, but a home they had chosen together, built together, filled with the accumulated memories of a family that had learned to choose each other every single day. "Mama," Violet's voice carried up the stairs. No longer the shy whisper of a toddler, but the confident call of a girl who had outgrown her thumb-sucking and most of her fears. "Luke put syrup on his bacon again?" "It's delicious," Luke shouted back, his voice carrying the same stubborn certainty that had characterized him since birth. "Tell her, Daddy." Cassandra smiled as she heard Damon's diplomatic response, something about compromise and trying new things in moderation. He had become masterful at navigating the daily negotiations that came with raising strong-willed children, though she suspected his boardroom experience had prepared him well for dealing with tiny dictators who could derail an entire morning over the proper distribution of breakfast condiments. She found them in the kitchen that had become the heart of their home, not because it was magazine-worthy, though it was beautiful, but because it was where they gathered every morning and evening, where homework was supervised and birthday cakes were decorated and important family decisions were made over cups of coffee and glasses of milk. Luke was indeed putting syrup on everything within reach, while Violet sat beside him with her carefully organized plate, each food group in its designated spot. Their personalities had only become more distinct with age. Luke, the adventurous experimenter, Violet, the thoughtful observer who took in every detail before making her move. "Good morning, beautiful," Damon said, looking up from where he was packing school lunches with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it every day for years. He wore jeans and a casual button-down, clothes that suggested a man heading to an office but not one who lived there. "Sleep well?" "Wonderfully," she said, accepting the coffee he handed her and the kiss he pressed to her temple. "Any urgent crises from Singapore this morning?" It was a running joke between them now, the way international business emergencies had once threatened to derail every family moment. These days, Damon's company ran so smoothly in his partial absence that genuine crises requiring his personal attention were rare enough to be remarkable. "Actually, yes," he said with mock seriousness. "Marcus called to inform me that the quarterly projections are ahead of schedule and he doesn't need me to review anything until next Tuesday. I told him I'd try to find time in my busy schedule of soccer games and parent-teacher conferences." Luke looked up from his syrup experiment. "Daddy, you're being silly. Marcus calls every day." "Every other day," Damon corrected, "and usually just to update me on good news these days." It was true. The transition from hands-on CEO to advisory chairman had taken longer than any of them had expected, but it had been ultimately successful. Damon's company was more profitable than ever. His employees were happier working for someone who trusted them with real responsibility, and Marcus had proven himself capable of handling everything Damon had once believed required his personal touch. "Speaking of parent-teacher conferences," Cassandra said, consulting the family calendar that had evolved into a complex work of art, covering everything from business trips to ballet recitals. "Mrs. Peterson wants to talk to us about Luke's reading level." "Too high again?" Damon asked with the resigned amusement of parents whose child had inherited a love of books that occasionally outpaced his emotional development. "He's reading chapter books but gets frustrated when other kids can't keep up with his pace during group reading time," Cassandra confirmed. "She thinks we might want to consider some enrichment options." Violet looked up from her perfectly organized breakfast. "Luke's really smart," she said matter-of-factly, "but he doesn't understand that not everyone thinks as fast as he does. I try to explain it to him, but he doesn't listen very well." The observation was delivered with the kind of gentle wisdom that had become Violet's trademark. She had grown into a natural mediator, someone who could see all sides of a situation and find ways to help people understand each other better. It was a gift that served her well on the playground and would probably serve her well in life. "We'll figure it out," Damon said, ruffling Luke's hair with the kind of casual affection that had replaced his once formal interactions with the children. "We always do." The morning continued with the familiar choreography of family life. Backpacks packed, teeth brushed, permission slips signed, minor disputes arbitrated. Cassandra watched Damon navigate it all with the ease of someone who had chosen this chaos over the orderly control of corporate life, and marveled again at how completely he had transformed. The man who had once managed his schedule in 5-minute increments now built buffer time into his day, for the unexpected moments that made parenting worthwhile. The man who had once believed his worth was measured in quarterly profits, now measured success in bedtime stories read and school plays attended and lazy. Saturday mornings spent building blanket forts. After dropping the twins at school, they drove together toward the hospital where Cassandra had returned to work part-time, splitting her attention between the NICU that had always been her calling and the family that had become her greatest joy. The balance wasn't always perfect. There were still days when work demands conflicted with family time, still moments when they had to choose between competing priorities, but they had learned to navigate those choices together, as a team. "I've been thinking," Damon said as they sat in traffic that would have once sent him into a frustrated frenzy, but now seemed like an opportunity for uninterrupted conversation, about expanding the foundation. The foundation had been Cassandra's idea, born from Damon's desire to find meaningful ways to use his wealth, and her observation that premature babies in underserved communities often lacked access to the specialized care they needed. What had started as a small pilot program had grown into a network of neonatal support centers across 3 states, all funded by Damon's company and staffed by medical professionals who shared Cassandra's passion for saving tiny lives. Expanding how? She asked, though she suspected she knew where this was heading. International, he said. There are hospitals in Southeast Asia that could benefit from the same kind of equipment and training we've been providing domestically. I know it would mean more travel, more time away from home, but the impact could be enormous. It was exactly the kind of project the old Damon would have thrown himself into completely, consuming every available hour and ounce of energy. But the new Damon had learned to think in terms of sustainable involvement, of ways to make a difference without sacrificing the family life they had worked so hard to build. What does that look like practically? She asked, falling into the pattern of thoughtful discussion that had become their default method for making major decisions. 3 trips a year, maybe 4, a week at a time, and only when school is out so the kids could come with us sometimes. The rest would be handled by local teams with virtual oversight. He glanced at her as they finally began moving again. It would be a family project, not just my project. Something we build together. The distinction mattered, represented years of learning the difference between individual ambition and shared purpose. The foundation had become their joint legacy, a way to use the resources Damon's success had provided in service of something larger than themselves. I think it sounds amazing, Cassandra said honestly, and I think Luke and Violet would love to be part of something that helps babies around the world. They had reached the hospital, and Damon pulled into the parking space that had become routine over the past few years. Before she got out, he caught her hand, a gesture that still sent warmth shooting through her arm even after all this time. I love you, he said simply, the words carrying the weight of years of choosing each other through ordinary days and extraordinary challenges. I love this life we've built. Even when Luke puts syrup on everything and Violet reorganizes the spice cabinet alphabetically, she teased. Especially then, he said seriously. The chaos, the noise, the constant negotiations over bedtimes and vegetables, and whether dinosaurs would have made good pets. All of it. I wouldn't trade any of it for the quiet efficiency of my old life. That evening, after homework was finished and dinner dishes were cleared and bedtime stories were read, Cassandra and Damon found themselves in their favorite spot, the back porch swing that looked out over a yard filled with evidence of their children's adventures. A tire swing hung from the oak tree, a vegetable garden showed signs of enthusiastic if not always successful cultivation, and a trampoline dominated one corner, surrounded by the kind of safety netting that spoke to parental wisdom earned through experience. Luke and Violet were visible through the sliding glass door, playing a complicated board game that seemed to involve more negotiation than actual gameplay. At 8, they had developed the kind of sibling relationship that mixed fierce loyalty with daily squabbles, deep affection with routine irritation. Watching them, Cassandra could see hints of the adults they would become, Luke's curiosity and determination, Violet's empathy and careful intelligence. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't been on that flight? Damon asked quietly, his arm tightening around her shoulders as the evening air grew cool around them. You mean if we had never found each other again? Or if we had found each other but couldn't make it work? If I had chosen business over family again? If you had decided I was too much of a risk to trust with their hearts? It was a question that haunted quiet moments sometimes, the awareness of how easily their second chance could have slipped away. How many small decisions had led to this moment? His choice to ignore the phone on Christmas morning, her decision to trust him with the truth about her fears, their mutual commitment to choosing love over pride every day since. I think, Cassandra said slowly, that we would have found each other eventually. Maybe not that Christmas, maybe not for years, but I think Luke and Violet would have brought us together somehow. They deserve to know their father, and you deserve to know them. The universe has a way of correcting its mistakes, and if I had been too stubborn or too scared to change, she considered this seriously, because it was a real question with real implications. The Damon who had walked away from their fight 5 years ago had been capable of choosing work over love, success over family, individual achievement over shared happiness. The transformation hadn't been automatic or easy. It had required daily choices, constant self-examination, and a willingness to rebuild his entire definition of success. Then I would have loved you from a distance and protected Luke and Violet from the disappointment, she said honestly. But I don't think that would have happened. The man I fell in love with was always capable of this kind of love, this kind of commitment. Success just temporarily convinced him he didn't deserve it. Through the glass door, Luke was attempting to explain the rules of their game to an increasingly skeptical Violet, his hands gesturing wildly as he made his case for why his latest move was totally legitimate and not at all a violation of the carefully negotiated terms they had established at the beginning. "They're so much like us," Damon observed with amusement. Luke with his grand plans and absolute certainty that he's right. Violet with her careful analysis and diplomatic problem-solving. "It's like watching our relationship in miniature. Except they're better at it than we were," Cassandra noted. "They fight, but they never walk away. They disagree, but they keep talking until they figure it out. Maybe they're learning something we had to teach ourselves the hard way. Or maybe they're just lucky enough to grow up in a house where love doesn't have to compete with everything else for attention." The observation was quiet, reflective, tinged with the kind of gratitude that came from understanding how close they had come to missing this entirely. Their children would grow up taking for granted the daily presence of two parents who chose each other consistently, who had learned to navigate conflict without destruction, who had built a life where success was measured in family dinners shared and milestones celebrated together. As if summoned by their conversation, Luke appeared at the sliding door, his hair disheveled from an apparent wrestling match with the couch cushions. "Mama, Daddy, can you settle an argument?" he asked with the dramatic flair that characterized all his requests for parental intervention. "Violet says I can't trade my vegetables for her dessert, but that's called negotiation, and negotiation is important in business, right, Daddy?" Damon's laugh was rich and delighted. "Well, technically you're right about negotiation being important in business," he said carefully. "But in families we eat our vegetables because they help us grow strong, not because we can trade them for something better. But what if I really, really don't like broccoli? Then you eat it anyway, because sometimes we do things we don't like because they're good for us," Cassandra said, recognizing a familiar parenting moment, just like how Daddy goes to boring meetings sometimes because they're part of taking care of our family. Luke considered this logic with the seriousness he brought to all adult explanations. "So eating vegetables is like doing work even when you don't want to?" "Exactly," Damon confirmed. "Except vegetables taste better than quarterly reports." Satisfied with this reasoning, Luke disappeared back inside to presumably eat his broccoli and continue his complicated game with Violet. Through the window they could see him explaining the new information to his sister, who listened with the patient attention she brought to all his elaborate theories about how the world worked. 5 years ago, if someone had told me that my greatest professional achievement would be convincing my son to eat his vegetables, I would have thought they were insane," Damon said with wonder. "And now I think they would have been absolutely right." The evening deepened around them, filled with the sounds of suburban summer, lawnmowers in distant yards, children playing before bedtime, the soft murmur of families settling into evening routines. Inside their house, Luke and Violet had migrated to the living room, where they were building an elaborate fortress out of couch cushions and throw pillows, their earlier disagreement forgotten in favor of collaborative architecture. "I have something to tell you," Cassandra said suddenly, her voice carrying a note of nervous excitement that made Damon turn to look at her fully. "Good something or bad something?" "Good something. Great something, actually." She took a deep breath, feeling like she was about to step off another cliff, but this time with absolute certainty about the landing. "We're going to have another baby." The announcement hung in the evening air between them, carrying with it implications for their carefully balanced life, their professional commitments, their family dynamics. Damon was very still for a long moment, and Cassandra could see him processing the information, working through all the practical considerations that would need to be addressed. Then his face broke into a smile so brilliant it could have powered the entire neighborhood. "Really? Really? About 6 weeks along, according to the doctor. Due in early spring, which means Luke and Violet will be big siblings by the time they turn 9. How do you feel about it?" he asked, his hand finding her still flat stomach with the kind of reverence that suggested he was already imagining the tiny life growing there. "Terrified," she admitted honestly, "and thrilled, and wondering how we're going to manage 3 children when 2 already feel like a full-time circus act." "We'll figure it out," he said, echoing his earlier words with the kind of confidence that came from years of successfully navigating unexpected challenges. "We always do." Inside the house, Luke and Violet were calling for their parents to come admire their architectural achievement, their voices bright with the assumption that the adults in their world would always be available to celebrate their accomplishments, no matter how small. "Should we tell them?" Cassandra asked. "Let's wait a little longer," Damon suggested. "Let's have this moment just for us first, then figure out how to explain that their world is about to get even more complicated and wonderful." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their children play and imagining their family expanding again, growing in ways that would require new adjustments and create new joys. The baby would grow up in a house where both parents chose family first, where love was demonstrated through daily presence rather than grand gestures, where success was measured in hugs given and bedtime stories shared. "Do you ever miss it?" Cassandra asked suddenly. "The simplicity of your old life? The clean efficiency of a world where your biggest concerns were quarterly projections and market analysis?" Damon considered the question seriously, as he considered all her questions these days. "Sometimes," he said honestly. "There were days when my biggest decision was which restaurant to choose for a business dinner, and now I have to referee debates about whether superheroes could realistically defeat dinosaurs in combat. Sometimes the complexity feels overwhelming. But those simple days were also empty days, clean and efficient and ultimately meaningless because there was no one to share them with who mattered more than the work itself." He tightened his arms around her, pulling her closer against his side. "I'd rather have chaos with you than order without you. I'd rather have syrup-covered breakfasts and bedtime story negotiations and arguments about vegetable consumption than all the successful deals in the world." Through the window, Luke and Violet had abandoned their fort in favor of a dance party, spinning around the living room to music only they could hear, their laughter creating a soundtrack of pure joy. At 8, they were old enough to be silly and young enough to be unself-conscious about it, caught in that perfect space between childhood wonder and growing sophistication. "They're going to be amazing big siblings," Cassandra observed, watching Luke help Violet execute a particularly dramatic spin. "They're amazing everything," Damon agreed, "just like their mother." The evening air was growing cool enough to suggest they should head inside, but neither of them moved to break the spell of the moment. In a few minutes, they would help Luke and Violet clean up their fort, supervise teeth brushing and pajama selection, read the bedtime stories that had become sacred family time. They would check email and set alarms and make tomorrow's plans, falling into the comfortable rhythms of a life built around loving each other well. But for now they sat on their porch swing, watching their children dance and contemplating the beautiful complexity of a life that had room for international business ventures and elementary school art projects, for foundation work and soccer practices, for professional achievement and family dinners where the most important conversations happened over dessert. "I have a question for you," Cassandra said finally, her voice taking on the tone she used when she wanted to explore something important. "If you could go back to that Christmas Eve flight, knowing everything you know now about how hard this would be, the compromises, the daily negotiations, the constant balancing of competing priorities, would you still choose this life?" It was a question that got to the heart of everything they had built together. Everything they had learned about love and sacrifice and the difference between what looked successful from the outside and what felt meaningful from within. It was a question about whether the messiness of shared life was worth the loss of individual control, whether the beautiful chaos of family was worth the challenges it created. Damon didn't answer immediately, and Cassandra could see him thinking it through with the kind of careful consideration he brought to all the decisions that mattered most. He was looking at Luke and Violet through the window, but she knew he was seeing beyond this moment to all the moments that had led here, the sleepless nights with sick children, the missed business opportunities, the daily choice to put someone else's needs ahead of his own immediate desires. "Every single time," he said finally, his voice carrying absolute certainty, "I would choose this life, this chaos, this beautiful mess of loving you and them, and building something together that's bigger than any individual success I could have achieved alone. I would choose family dinners over business dinners, bedtime stories over board meetings, and the complicated joy of being needed by people I love more than the simple satisfaction of being professionally indispensable." He paused, looking directly into her eyes with the kind of intensity that still made her heart skip after all these years. "But more than that, I would choose the person I've become because of this life, because of loving you, because of being Luke and Violet's father. I like who I am when I'm with you better than who I was when I was trying to conquer the world alone." The answer was everything she had hoped to hear, and more than she had expected. It was an acknowledgement not just of their relationship, but of the fundamental transformation that had made their second chance possible. The old Damon had been capable of love, but he hadn't been capable of the kind of daily, consistent choosing that real love required. The man sitting beside her had learned to find success in service, achievement in availability, and meaning in the mundane moments that created a lifetime of shared happiness. "I love you," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of 5 years of choosing each other through ordinary days and extraordinary challenges. "I love you too," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "All of you. This whole beautiful, chaotic, perfect family we've built together." Inside the house, Luke and Violet had settled down to a quieter activity, their heads bent together over a book as Luke attempted to read aloud to his sister. Their voices carried through the evening air, a gentle murmur of sibling affection and shared stories, the soundtrack of a childhood built on security and unconditional love. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Cassandra found herself thinking about the question that had started it all 5 years ago on a Christmas Eve flight. What would Damon do if he discovered the truth about Luke and Violet? The answer had been better than her wildest hopes, and more complicated than her worst fears. He had become exactly the father they needed and the partner she had always known he could be, but it had required a fundamental reordering of everything he thought he knew about success and meaning, and what made a life worth living. Now, with another child on the way and their foundation expanding internationally and Luke and Violet growing into remarkable little humans, the question had evolved into something deeper. How far would someone go to protect and nurture a love worth saving? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Looking at this family's journey from that chaotic Christmas Eve encounter to this peaceful evening 5 years later, what do you think is the most important factor in making a second chance at love truly work? Is it the willingness to change, the courage to forgive, or something else entirely? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.